Tonight we have Mary Wallis. And Mary was a clinical nurse specialist in palliative care for many years with Alberta Health Services. She is taught at the U of C Faculty of Nursing and at the Cummings School of Medicine, and continues her involvement with the Canadian Association of Health Humanities. She holds a PhD in English literature. Her thesis was a study of Anglo-Saxon wisdom poetry, a little known but beautiful topic. For many years, Mary was involved with the pilgrimage route to Santiago, how will I pronounce it? Compostela. I was actually going to pronounce it that way, but I didn't want to get it wrong. Okay, good. And has journeyed this old medieval trail across the north of Spain many times. So in addition to a decades-long practice of Buddhist meditation, Mary's work in palliative care and her research into wisdom traditions and pilgrimage have given her insight into the varied ways that human beings engage with both life and death. She has been a frequent public speaker on many matters related to end-of-life care, contemplative care of the dying, and self-care of health professionals. So, well, wonderful and so needed. So tonight, as you may or may not know, this is part 2 of Mary's talk. And every time I introduce this, as I brought it up, like in previous weeks, I always have a little giggle because you felt like your first session didn't quite cover what you'd originally came to present, which was back in October. And it was entitled, "When is a Story Not a Story?" And having felt that she never fully, completely answered this question, we now come with an expansion on that original topic, which I really love. And then the fact that really the paradox is that the truth cannot be found within any story. So I really quite love that too. And for me, and I think all of us, we're really excited, Mary, to have you back and to explore this topic. And we look forward to hearing from you tonight.
Thank you very much, Christine.
So,
Get this lined up a little bit here.
sure.
The top of my head has been cut off.
How about me?
So there,
Move it.
move it back,
Yeah.
but there's a lot of me showing.
I love
So,
that. 'Cause
okay,
you're our
here we go.
focus. Wonderful. And so
Thanks.
Mary, I can give you a bit of a time check.
Yes, please do.
Yeah?
Yes,
So maybe I'll give you like a 10-minute.
yep, do that.
Love it.
I may go a little longer or a little shorter depending on how we do. So thank you for the nice introduction, Christine. And hello, everyone. And hello online. I don't think anybody's watching right now. This is for
Nobody's
later,
watching. Just-
but still.
Yeah, they will be at some
Okay.
point.
So yeah, last October I gave a talk entitled "When is a Story Not a Story?" And we got partway there. Was anyone there other than Bob? Bob was there. Anybody else? Nobody heard? Okay. So Bob, you can keep me honest if I deviate too far from what I said the first time around. Yeah, yeah. Hmm?
They said he's dying. Like, please don't do that tonight.
No, please don't. So there was no clear answer to the question, when is a story not a story? Phil put me on the spot and asked me for a title real quick the last time. So that was the one I came up with and I immediately regretted it. So, and I still do because I'm not sure I even answer it tonight, but it doesn't matter. I have other things to say. First of all, though, with due respect to Bob's having been here before, I would like to recap some of the main points from my talk last fall for a couple of reasons. And one is that I've heard many wonderful talks. I've given lots of talks. The shelf life of even the best talks is quite short. And so you tend to forget, you may come away with a few key points, but you tend to forget the substance a little bit. And I've always found that listening to talks redone, if I listen to Joseph Goldstein, for example, the great meditation teacher in the US, if I listen to his talks 3 or 4 times, like you were saying before, Jody, every time you hear it, it's different and it's better. You glean more. So that's one reason for my recapping what went on in the fall. But I'm also going to embellish a little bit of what I was talking about then because I've had time to think it through a bit more. And then I'll move into the second part of the presentation, which is has a literary bent. As Christine mentioned, I have a background in English literature, medieval English, and I know what you're thinking, but it did turn out to be quite useful. So it's something that I'd like to bring forward tonight with a couple of other pieces of literature, very short, just to illustrate what I'm going to be talking about in the area of stories and how we can call stories into question. When is a story maybe not best told as a story, but told as something else, for example? So the first point from last fall was that human beings, in their most deepest nature, are storytellers. We're created to make stories. That's what our brains do. That if you watched your brain while Christine was taking you through your meditation earlier, you probably noticed the arising of little bits of data that came up that you were going to turn into a story. What am I going to do when I go home? What did I do this afternoon? Just little snippets of thought that immediately turn into stories, which is the very natural thing that the brain does. And then the practice of meditation is to catch that impulse of the brain and just come back to the focus of the breath so that you can step out of your story even before it's taken a real hold on you. Because as you'll see later in the talk, we can get very caught up in our stories and they can be harmful. So the brain's job is to make stories, to create a sort of a template, a pattern for how we get through the world. We organize everything that's coming at us in our experience in stories so that it makes sense to us and we can move through the world according to a particular story. And so just like the heart, its job is to pump blood through the body to give us oxygen, and the kidneys make us urine so we can pee out what we don't need anymore in our bodies. Our brain's job is to create stories. And sometimes also, just like kidneys, you have to discard a few. You have to pee them away because they're not needed or they're a bit toxic. And so sometimes stories need to be judged and let go of, and other stories need to be held on to because they're useful for our getting along in the world. Stories are based on the beginning of based on the idea of a beginning and an end. So we're born and we die. That's a kind of the basic story of us as individuals. And we each have a life that starts and ends. And inside that life, there are zillions of smaller stories that unfold that help us find a path through life, find answers to things, create a career, decide what to do, stories that help us go shopping, all those little things that go together to form the little stories of our lives. And then at the other end of the scale are the larger, bigger stories, bigger than us. The stories about why we're here, where we're going when we leave this earth. What's right? How do we decide what's right and what's wrong? And how do we make decisions? All those larger stories that contain us or hold us. The example that I gave in the fall, and Bob, you may remember this one, because I personally really appreciate this one because it's so illustrative of how embedded stories are in our minds and in our lives. If you think of the Aboriginal groups in Australia, they've been there for 60,000 years, and they orient themselves to that vast land by embedding stories in the landscape. So that if it's easy to get lost in Australia, if anybody has been in the outback, it's just a huge desert. But they have stories that will tell you that Mr. Snake went that way and he went up on that hill there, and you can see the hump up there where he lay down to take a rest. And then the eagle came and spoke to the snake, and then he flew over there. So I know if I go up to that hill there and I see that ridge where the snake was or is, and I know to go right because that's where the eagle went. And so the stories and the land become embedded kind of in each other. And from birth, Aborigines learn the stories, they recite them, they dance them, they sing them. They know them so well that when they go out to find water, to find food, to hunt, to travel around, to migrate, to go to see other tribes, to trade, they cannot get lost in the world, because the stories are so embedded. They just know where they are in the land because the story is embedded in the land. And that's how fundamental stories are in or can be in our lives. It's a wonderful example of how stories support us and give pattern and meaning and direction to the world that we live in so we can survive. They pulled it off for 60,000 years. So pretty impressive. Stories also put a frame around things that disturb us. So if you think of our mortality, there are very few people who don't have some way of understanding the fact that they or other people die. We have a story for that to contain that reality. And so when you read an obituary, how many of you are frustrated when you just read that somebody, perhaps someone you know, has died, and they give the date and he was surrounded by relatives, and you want more? What did he die of? What happened? We want that story to help us contain that new reality that someone has died. So a story will help us. And I notice now reading obituaries, not that I read them very often, but more and more people now are saying died of cancer, died of heart disease, died of dementia, because they're aware that people want to know what the story was so that they can contain what happened a little more easily. Evil people, evil events, natural disasters, they all inspire us to create a story so that we're not freaked out by them. We can hold them and absorb them into our reality and move on. Trauma happens when something is so outside your story that you just really struggle to absorb it. It just does not make sense. It doesn't fit. So a catastrophic accident, for example, you lose a leg. I remember a patient I had when I was first out of nursing school, and he had a motorcycle accident, which has made me a permanent enemy of motorcycles, by the way. But anyway, he lost his leg. He was, I don't think he ever, I saw him in later years. I don't think he ever was able to absorb that new truth in his life. He could not find a place to put that trauma. For most people, the healing from trauma involves, among other things, to create a story that will, now this is me and I can contain this new reality. You create another sense of yourself that will hold who I am now as opposed to who I was then. But there's a huge gap between who I was then and who I am now. And that can take a long time to build a new identity, a new story that will hold that truth. And the problem with PTSD that's severe is that people are struggling to find a place to put this thing that just doesn't fit the picture at all, doesn't fit the reality, it doesn't fit the story that they have of themselves. I thought the universe was like this, but look what happened. I heard this all the time in palliative care. I did everything right. I ate right. I did all the things. I followed the script, and I'm still dying of cancer. What happened? That doesn't fit. So stories, when they're properly used, and sometimes we need therapy to help us create a new story, that will help us find a way to hold a new reality. Stories also, another point from last fall, can cause tremendous suffering. There are stories that are toxic. We've all had childhood trauma. I don't think anybody's exempt from that. Even the most well-meaning parent makes mistakes, and sometimes those mistakes can be very traumatic. We have political stories that are very destructive. We have religious stories that are very harmful to our psyches. So there are many ways in which stories can be quite damaging. Our brains are very, very good at creating an operating system that will protect us from most things. They give us stories, they help us through, they find patterns. But that operating system of the brain has bugs. And the brain is so dominant that often what your brain is telling you actually feels like it's truer than it actually is. We start believing what our brains tell us because it's such a commanding presence in our being. And so if we think something, it's very easy to think, if I think it, it must be true. And sometimes we hang on to things that may or may not be true, but they are harmful. And it's very difficult to see them. Our brains deceive us sometimes. Now, this is an idea that was recognized very early by the Buddha, who said that our brains provide us with stories, but they are delusions. The way we describe the world is a little bit how it is. It's enough of how it is that we get by, but it's not necessarily telling you the truth all the time. Your brain is not always accurate. And the Buddha's message involve finding the wisdom to uncover the tendency of our egos to believe everything it tells itself, right? To believe our ego. And the need that we have to sort out false views from true ones, or better, sort out harmful views from helpful ones. But you have to be able to step out of the story to understand, okay, to take a look at the story and understand, okay, is this helpful or not? So we're always faced with a choice when we look at our stories. Is this story taking me somewhere I need to go? Or is this story just not helpful at all to myself or other people? Or is this story just junk that's sitting around in my head? I call these junk stories. They just take up space. They're not harmful, they're not helpful. They're just there. And do I really need to be thinking about, do I really need to be looking at what Jennifer Lopez wore at some awards show? You know, is this a story that I need to be following, or is this just junk in my head? It's not harmful, particularly, it's not helpful, but it's just junk. So we need to look at all our stories, even the ones that probably don't serve any purpose except taking up space. And then we have this ethical decision to make. Are these stories helping or hurting myself or other people? I'm going to tell you a little example of this. We often think of looking at our stories and as for finding something negative, like, oh, this is a harmful one, it's bad for me to think this. We're very, very self-punitive as human beings. We always look on the dark side of ourselves. But I'm going to tell you a small vignette that is the opposite. And it happened to me last week when Brian Mulroney died. I don't know what you think of Mulroney, doesn't matter. I lived in Ottawa in the 1980s. And I lived, as it happened, down the street from 24 Sussex, which is where the Prime Minister and his family lived, on the slightly unfashionable end of New Edinburgh, where that area was. And I happened to know someone who was in the press corps for the Parliament. And he had been invited to a garden party for the press corps at 24 Sussex. Brian was going to be there and all the parliamentary people. And I guess the person he was going with had stood him up. I forget what had happened, but he called me and said, I need somebody to go to this garden party at 24 Sussex. Do you want to go? Well, naturally, I said yes. And so I got all dressed up and I walked over and I met this guy over there. And then we went to the garden party, which was absolutely lovely. I don't think they have them anymore, but there was champagne and little sandwiches and cakes and people milling around. It was extremely pleasant. And I shook hands with Brian Mulroney, which was frankly no big deal. But I met Mila. And Mila was a delight. She was just a very charming, compassionate, friendly, warm person. She had a lot of integrity. She was very well turned out. She looked beautiful. But I was delighted to have met her. And we had a very nice conversation. And that was it. I then left, and my memory of that and that whole story that I just told you is stuck in my head. I like that story about my life. It's one it's not junk. I really want to hang on to that one. But when Brian died, I began to think about this story again. It recalled it all back to me. And out of the blue, spontaneously arose a feeling of great compassion and outpouring for Mila. I thought, oh, that poor woman, I wonder how she feels. It wasn't pity. It was really a sense of compassion that arose in me. This does not mean I'm a compassionate person. It does mean that, like every other human being, there are the seeds of compassion in me, just like with everybody. And I noticed when it came up, because I've been doing some meditation and it just sort of arose. And I thought, this is an emotion that is helpful. It's helpful to me and it's helpful to other people. And I need to keep that emotion and nurture it. And I can then perhaps apply that in situations where somebody's not so nice. Mila is easy, to feel compassion for her. And, my heart went out to her, really. I think it's a gigantic loss for her. But just noticing that there was compassion in me and investigating that and seeing, this is what it feels like. That's a pretty good feeling. And I think it's a good one to hold on to. That story led me to that feeling. And that's how we we can combine our stories with an ethical dimension, then we can decide, yeah, this brought up something in me I want to nurture, as opposed to other stories that we may have that make us angry and make us cling to hate or cling to views that are harmful to ourselves, give us ulcers and heart disease, or make us unkind to other people. We can choose. This story makes those feelings come up. My story about Mila happened to make a compassionate feeling come up that I wanted to share with you as an example of finding the goodness within us that we can cultivate. So stories work for good or for ill, depending. And this is really when we realize this, when we can step out of the story, that to me is the beginning of liberation. When we can begin to separate ourselves from what our brains are telling us and take a look at it. And this means we need to step into where Christine took us earlier, the unstoried self. That was a phrase I used last fall. You may remember that one, Bob. The unstoried self, the who I am without my story, the person that just is before the stories start to form. Can I place myself there? And in Christine's meditation, there was a gesture towards that of just coming to peace, no matter how I am. I might be sitting uncomfortably in my chair. I love that way of starting a meditation. And this is me with no story, just me. And we try to stay with that sensation of just who we are in this moment without attaching ourselves to any particular image of ourselves or story about ourselves. And just coming to rest, being in the present, being in the room. That's the unstoried self, the you without all the stuff that comes up. And I'll bet, just as it did for me in the meditation, lots of stuff comes up, especially me. I'm on the hook because I've got to give a talk. So you can imagine where my head was. I was out in the future and am I going to mess this up or am I not going to mess it? I had two parallel stories going. But it was interesting to observe that because we see how our stories can distract us so easily from that self that just can sit on the chair and be in the room without being drawn away. Larry Rosenberg, who's one of the older meditation teachers from the US, he's well into his 80s now. I really like Larry. Larry was the guy who really got me onto the Vipassana meditation. But he talks about meditation as starting off, you're looking for who you think you are. So you're looking for yourself. I'm going to find myself in meditation and looking for the stories, defining yourself. And the more you meditate, the more you sit with that unstoried self, the more you find out who you're not. And it's very liberating to discover, I don't really have to be that way. That's a story I'm telling myself. I can leave that one or I can buy into it either way, but I don't have to be bound by the stories that are harmful to me. So the only place to do that is from the place of the unstoried self, where you can look at that clearly. So we can live without our stories. And in that place, that's our vantage point. And it's so important that we start with meditation because if we take away our stories, just like in trauma, when something sudden happens and we're not who we thought we were, it's very unsettling. So we always need a meditation practice to anchor us and train the mind to be still in the presence of the unexpected things that may come up in our minds that destabilize us. So we can't just sort of step into an unstoried self and say, I'm going to get rid of all my stories and off we go. It's that it can be very unsettling to be in the unstoried place. Letting go of some of the things that you cling to that seem to define who you are, but also give you pain. So it can be very disorienting, and that's why we need to have a meditation practice to provide some stability in the process. And what you discover as you go on through training the mind and investigating stories is that I'm still here, and the universe is still holding me even without my stories. That's the great discovery. And that to me is faith. Knowing that just in the old Methodist hymn, just as I am, that's what they're talking about. I don't have to be anything or have any particular story. The universe is holding me just while I sit here in this room, just sitting, doing nothing. So Joseph Goldstein has a very interesting little story about when he was first practicing meditation in Thailand, and he had long hair. It was the 60s. And long hair in the 60s meant a lot. There's a whole story with hair. And he liked his long hair. He no longer has it. But he really, that was part of the shtick in the 60s, was to have long hair when you're meditating. And it was proposed to him that he stop and cut his hair, shave his head. Well, he agonized about this. Like, what will I be without how am I ever going to be anybody? And finally he took the plunge and shaved his head. And he said, what do you think happened? Nothing. Nothing happened at all. It made absolutely no difference. He let his story go about his hair, and he was still just the same. Everything was fine. Nothing happened. And it was a good lesson for him in how simple it can be to let go, and how liberating it can be to discover these things that we cling to aren't really that important. They don't really support us in the way that we would like to think they do. I'm going to just check the time here and have a sip. How are we doing? Am I down to, I kind of lost track of myself.
We have like 12 minutes.
That's perfect. I think I can pull this off. If we don't, I'll come back for part 3. That's a threat. I better finish this. So that was the summary of many of the things that we talked about last fall. And I'm just going to highlight them again to be sure. So the brain is a natural storyteller. Stories put frames around things that trouble us, give us problems, help us to find safety in a story. Stories can cause suffering, which means that we need to look at our stories carefully to see what effect they're having. And we can find a place in the unstoried self. There is a part of myself that is not my story. And that's where we need to try and find a focus and a place to live from. So I don't know how many of you read the blurb that went around in the email. There were 2 poems. It was about this talk, and then there were 2 poems. One is not a poem, it's just a list. And then there was a second poem. Did anybody get a chance to look at that? Don't be afraid if it didn't. We've all got so many things on the go. Okay, just so I know. So I'm going to present 3 literary works. 2 are very, very short, one's a little longer, that illustrate some of the points that I've been making. So the first one is from a book called The Book of Imaginary Beings by Luis Borges. Luis Borges was a brilliant Argentinian writer. He wrote a lot of what I think we would call now magic realism. He had a highly imaginative mind, but he was brilliant. He read everything, and he was blind. And I think he read most of it in Braille in his later days. One of these phenomenal people who are not in any way deterred by a disability. And to be playful, he quotes what he calls a certain Chinese encyclopedia. And you know how our brains like to make lists and patterns, so that classifications of things, we get data in and we classify it and we organize it, and then we're good to go because we've got the world organized and we can move on. So he quotes from a certain Chinese encyclopedia, a taxonomy of animals. Now we would say, okay, there's animals, there's wild animals and tame animals, and there's cats, and under cats, there's different kind of cats, and then dogs, there's under dogs, and you know how we would logically arrange all animals. So this is from the Chinese encyclopedia, their version of animals. Animals are divided into 1, belonging to the emperor. Okay. 2, embalmed animals. All right. 3, tame animals. 4, sucking pigs. E, sirens, whatever that is. I've got 6, fabulous animals. 7, stray dogs. 8, animals that are included in the present classification. 9, frenzied animals. 10, innumerable animals. 11, animals that are drawn with a very fine camel hair brush. 12, etc. 13, animals that have just broken the water pitcher. 14, animals that from a long way off look like flies. Isn't that hilarious? So what we discover, and this is what Borges writes, in the wonderment of this list, the thing we understand in one great leap is that this exotic way of organizing thoughts shows us the limitation of our own way of thinking, the stark impossibility that we would ever, any of us come up with a list like this to classify our animals. It's completely out of what any list that I know of animals, completely bizarre. And it makes you laugh to think of it, doesn't it? I mean, it's just hilarious because your mind just cannot take it in. But that's sort of the place of this unstoried mind. You're in that place where it's all just, it's not making sense yet. You haven't put it in a pattern. It's completely foreign. And this pattern is incomprehensible. It's like that great Zen saying, a Zen monk was asked, what is the secret of Zen in 3 words? And his answer was, walk on. Just the mind can't deal with that. So this is funny and amusing, and it's a very playful way of looking at what the brain can and can't do. And my point is the funniness of it. We see images in Buddhist teachings of the laughing Buddha. The laughing Buddha represents the liberated heart. It is that laughter happens when you pass through the doorway of the enclosed mind. When you're out of it, you're like Tweety Bird. We at last. You can escape and you see, oh, the mind just makes this up. I'm over here. It's a wonderful feeling of liberation. So for those of us who think that Buddhist or any other kind of liberation is a very somber affair, actually it's very joyful. And it's often described as a source of laughter. And it's not ha-ha laughter like a joke, but it's that laughter of a deep joy that of liberation. So I was interested to see your reaction to this tonight, to this list, because it is funny. And what you're laughing at is, it's so bizarre that, it just takes you right out of what you think is the normal way of looking at things. Yeah, frees the mind. So I'm going to tell you a slightly more complicated one now. This is, Christine mentioned, I studied wisdom literature in the Old English tradition. And the poem that I studied was from the 9th century in England. The poem is called The Dialogue of Solomon and Saturn. And this is a Christian wisdom dialogue. These are a dime a dozen. This happens to be from Christian England of the 9th century, but they're common all over the world. And there's a lot of them in Buddhist teachings as well. These dialogues between the teacher and a student who is unlettered or has wrong views or is, in this case, just kind of a smart aleck and a jerk and needs to be brought around to thinking about things in a better way. So it's a kind of an education for a student who needs help from a wise person. And this poem, like many others of its kind, uses language to take apart the language that the student is using. So it's a great play on words. There's lots of riddles, there's songs, there's all sorts of things that break down stories. It's not stories, it's riddles and contests, wit contests, back and forth, sparring. And the point is that your story is not telling you the absolute truth. You need to step out of your story to find something that you can rely on. So this dialogue is between the wise King Solomon that we all know from the Old Testament, and Saturn is the character. It's not the Saturn in the sky. He's a figure that originated in the Far East, and he's a jerk. He's unwise. He's vulgar, but he's very smart, and he thinks he's real hot stuff. And he challenges Solomon to a contest of wit. And you know who's going to win, right? We've got that part figured out. He is smart. He's trying to figure things out. He is basically, like many of us, wandering around in what Buddhists would call samsara. He's just floating around the world, making stuff up, being angry, being hostile, being sort of Trumpish about things, and he doesn't have much of an anchor in anything that's going to help him find any kind of redemption or liberation. So they go head to head in a dialogue, and it's basically an education in what Buddhists would call right view and right thought. They argue with a lot of riddles. And the only example I'm going to give you from it's a very long poem, is that there's a discussion about fate and free will. And Saturn is an astrologer. And so he thinks the story of your life is written in the stars. And the question that he asks Solomon is what we would all find. What happens when a mother gives birth to twins? Astrologically, they should have the same outcome, but why does one twin go bad and the other twin do okay? Like, why doesn't it work? Why doesn't the story about that the stars tell us should happen? Why doesn't it happen on real life? And Solomon gives a very interesting answer. And I'm going to just read you a little bit about it. And this is all, by the way, in Old English. You'll never find this in modern English. And it's a very complicated language to learn. But in a nutshell, what he says is a mother doesn't know when her child is born what will be his fate. But for sure, says Solomon, fate works through family generations. So if you ever thought that this idea of generational trauma is new, it's something that has been around for a very long time, that we know that the hardships of parents and their parents passed down through generations. It's why we're struggling with reconciliation, isn't it?
There's actually a book that Katie referred to in the very beginning of my healing journey. It's called It Didn't Start With You.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's a wonderful idea to be resurrected now. We used to just blame ourselves, but now we see it in the broader view. But this is an old idea that our fate is determined to a very large extent by our families. But Solomon also says fate may be powerful, but he introduces the idea that the mind has agency. So you can make a choice. Once you know your story, you can decide what to do. So one twin goes wrong and the other goes right. Those twins have made decisions. And the one who goes wrong is the one who didn't know that he could live by a different story. So he doesn't really answer the question whether it's fate or free will. That's not the point. The point is, yeah, we're stuck in this dichotomy of, well, some of it's conditioned and you can make a choice. But the point is, there's a mind that can decide. You can step out and look. So it's a brilliant insight from 9th century England. You wouldn't have thought. By the way, just out of interest, the Old English word for fate is weird, W-Y-R-D, from which we get the modern word weird, as something that happens kind of out of the blue that we didn't expect to happen, that doesn't fit the story. In Old English, that was fate. That was something that was meant to happen. And in our view now, it's meant to happen. We didn't expect it, but it happened and it's strange. But that's the origin of our word weird, is from the Old English word for weird, for fate. Similarly, the word for mind in Old English is mod, M-O-D. And what it's referring to in Old English is the mind that can make decisions, that sees things, that rationalizes, that decides. It's kind of a free-floating entity, just the way our minds are now. We can use our minds and they can be tainted for ill or they can be improved. So the mind is very plastic. The brain is plastic. And this is implied in this idea that back in the 9th century, that you can change your mind. You can transform your mind. The word mood now comes from the Old English mod, and now it just means how you're feeling in the moment, my mood. At the time it was used in Old English, it meant much more than that. It meant what we refer to now as our mind. So there's lots of connections between now and then. So this is a really complex poem, and predictably, because it's a Christian poem, it ends with a new story. Solomon presents Saturn with the Christian story of the biblical story, fall and redemption. That's what we would expect from a Christian poem from the 9th century. What's interesting, so I wanted to give you that example. But I want to just shift over to a little bit of historical observation. That story has become the governing story, or was for centuries, the Christian story. And everybody thought the same. Now we don't. And so we noticed that that story has lost some of its authority. It's no longer the single story that holds us all together as a country or as a nation or as a group. Some people are still strong Christians, no harm there, but it's not something that's universally held. And at the time, about 500 years after this poem, we had the Protestant Reformation, which is a questioning of the story that the church told you had to believe. You weren't allowed to read the Bible. You had to believe what the church told you. You could only go through the priest for redemption and absolution. You know, all those things that the church, you had to believe that. That was the story. And the Protestants said, hey, wait a minute. I don't buy this anymore because this story is not helpful to me anymore. This is a corrupt church, and it's using this story in a harmful way. So this is the same idea of how stories can be helpful or harmful. We can think about it personally for ourselves, our own stories, but even historically, stories run into problems. They outlive their usefulness, and they have to be called into question at some point. Hence the Protestant Reformation. The Protestants said, get rid of what the church is telling you to believe. You can read the Bible for yourself. You don't have to pay the priest to get absolution, get forgiven. You can go straight to Jesus yourself. That's what the Protestants said. You didn't have to buy all this other story. Fantastic example of how stories just wear out. They come in for their own revision after time. A very similar thing happened in India with Buddhism. What the Buddha said is the Hindu view of karma is not written in stone. It's your caste. You're not defined by your caste. You're defined by the decisions that you can make. You are free of your caste. It's a very interesting parallel with what happened in Europe in the 16th century, what happened in India with the Buddha in 500 BC. This idea that you're not subject to karma. You're not subject to your caste. That doesn't define who you are. Anybody who can think for themselves can find liberation in this life. So it's a similar kind of revolt against a story that was already wearing thin in India at the time. There were lots of people saying this, but the Buddha said it extremely well, and it seems to have stuck. So it's interesting how stories of all kinds come in for revision and change when they cease to be useful. So when is a story not a story? Oh, why did I ever? A story is not a story when it becomes a riddle, when it turns into something else, when it's shown to have loopholes, when you can pull apart the language and find that it doesn't actually tell you the whole truth. When it becomes a means of social control, it's no longer a story, it's propaganda. It's dogma. You can turn stories on their heads. So it's not the same story as it was before. And it's not a story when your independent mind can see a story as an arbitrary arrangement of data. That's all it is. That's a story. Your brain put together sensory experience and turned it into a pattern, a story. It has to do this. It's a good thing that it does, or none of us would survive, but it has its flaws. It has its weaknesses. And so we can choose with an independent mind whether to buy into our stories or not. So I'm going to end with a much lighter example of this. Oh, I forgot to tell you one important thing about Saturn. Once he gets the whole story spelled out to him, the Christian story, and he's let go of all his junky stuff from before, and Solomon's convinced him of the real truth. The line in the Old English is, he laughed from his heart. He laughed with joy. And it's interesting that the word laughter comes up several times towards the end of the poem when it's all finished. There's that laughter again that we saw in the first example when we all laughed, and the laughing Buddha, same idea. So here's a final example. This is a poem, and it was also in what was mailed out to you. So if you want to read it again, you can have a look at it. It's called Walking the Dog by a physician named, is anybody a physician here? I thought somebody was last time. A physician named John Wright. And he obviously is a general practitioner, and he has a very fat lady in his office. And so he writes a poem about her. And the poem goes like this. She weighed 300 pounds. Fat and high sugars were killing her, I thought. So I gave her a puppy with dark curly hair. Nothing else had worked. Walking the dog twice a day, I thought, might persuade, might motivate. She was pleased with my prescription. She laughed. She rocked from side to side. She lived for 12 years, hugging that little black dog, while her lean husband walked it faithfully twice a day. It's a good one. And it has all the elements of what I've been chatting with you tonight about. First of all, he repeats the word thought 3 times. I thought, and then I thought, so, I thought, so, I thought. And there's the story. I thought, I'm thinking the textbook, I'm thinking it through, I'm going by the textbook. I'm thinking, stuck in his mind, and so always means so, something's going to happen, the story is going to move on. So he's making his own story.
You must have been friends.
Probably.
Yeah.
She was pleased with my prescription and she laughed. Now, we're the ones laughing, but he's injected the idea of laughter into this poem. It's kind of a sense of release. And the lady's happy. And then the husband walked it faithfully. And there's the word faith. This idea that getting out of your stories requires some faith and makes you laugh. So I wanted to end on that poem because I thought it contained in a nutshell, all the things that I've been talking about for a long time. So that's the end. But don't laugh. But I'm wondering if you have any comments or questions or anything you'd like to say or complain about or add, subtract. You're welcome.
Mary, I'm loving what you did to tie the story and the observer. I think
Oh.
that was like so powerful, like how we're able
Yeah.
to actually come to that unstoried part of ourselves, like
Yeah.
the observer that is a part of us, that consciousness to actually see that we're in story and realize that. And I like creative writing and I enjoy it as well. And one of the techniques of creatives and, those who witness it is that we are asking for them to suspend disbelief.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
maybe you could talk a little bit about that, because I think that that's a really interesting exploration when we're able to suspend disbelief.
Yeah.
And actually let the story go so that it can evolve to whatever it may be, without being attached, because I think that also speaks.
Yeah.
So I just offer that.
Right. Yeah. Thanks for that. It reminds me of something that I read just tonight. And it was talking about emptiness in meditation, that Zen notion of emptiness. And emptiness is the source of creativity. It's the heart of the creative mind to allow something to just arise out of emptiness. I'm not sure I believe that completely, but I think it's very helpful to see that letting go of other competing stories and descending into a place where it's just kind of empty allows other creative stories to arise. It creates space. It gets rid of the junk stories and lets something else come forward. The other thing I was thinking about creativity and suspending disbelief, you know what that means, eh? When you go into a movie and the lights go down and you're in that movie. If it's a good one, and it doesn't matter if it's something that could never in a million years happen. You're in it and you believe it while you're watching it, because your brain is like that. It sees something and that must be it. And and the lights are down and it's all easy to suspend disbelief. And then when you walk out of the theater, it's that weird feeling, isn't it? Of, that was a story. This is not a story. This is my life out here in the real world.
Or
And-
perhaps is.
or perhaps, I was just thinking that. But it's that moment when you come out of the theater and recognize that you were in the story and now you're out of it. That's a very important moment to stay alert to. Just check in when your mind discovers, oh, you made a switch, you're out of a story. And become accustomed to that notion of stepping out of whatever you were thinking with such conviction. And what's that like? That little moment where you come to yourself and think, oh, all right, that was just a story. But what a good story. And can I use that story to make some decisions about how I am in the world? Or does it give me some clues about how I might be kinder to myself or other people? But a good artist will take you into a story and let you become so involved with it that you make your own, you draw your own conclusions while you're in the story, right? And you become part of it, and it influences how you are when you come out of the story. So that's good art. If you come out of a book feeling exactly the same as when you went into it, there was something wrong with the book. Say more. Yeah, oh yes. Gary, you had a comment.
Thank you for remembering my name. Yes.
Yeah.
Judy. Laughter. The story of meeting Brian Mulrooney in the garden party. What sort of little cakes?
Yeah, there's chocolate in the kitchen if that's what you're leading to. No, it was very well done. It was probably an extremely good chef or baker that they got the best. Your taxes contributed.
Tickled me to think of, gee, I'm gonna circle back to that because that makes my kiddo laugh. What sort of cakes?
I love that too, but it's also a reminder of all of our senses and their involvement in the story.
Yeah,
Like what you remember, like what you tasted and what you saw, and maybe the flowers and just how people were showing up, like just how a story lands with us when it is so powerful in all aspects of the senses, when we're open to receive,
yeah.
It's interesting with that show that I rewatched quickly. Do you know? So I'm a esthetician, medical esthetician, just under a skin doctor. So I find it fascinating that our brains are a protein, or our whole body's a protein making,
Yeah,
like, that's what we do.
Yeah.
Right? So when you're talking about, the brain and its stories, I'm thinking, deeper than that. It's like, our receptors, our neuron receptors are making, they're called peptides.
Mhm.
Okay, so then our cells have these receptors like key in the lock, right?
Mhm.
And our proteins are based on our emotions and our state of mind.
Mhm.
And so when people are like aging rapidly, or, it's most likely that they're not making the right peptides, right?
Mhm.
I know this is really sciencey, but it brings back to you, like, if you change your mind, you could change your life.
Mhm.
Really, well, Dr. Verslipton and Dr. Joe Dispenza, like the gurus of that, but it's like, you're right, when you have the door of perception is open, and we just watched something comedy, something boosh. I just asked my friend to send me the name, but anyways, they have skits, comedy skits, and these two wise men were out, hippies, and they had this great big afro with a door. in the, yeah, and so the guy, he wanted to have a door because he didn't have a door, and the wise guy was trying to teach him, and then at the end, he got his door, but it just,
Yeah,
it's really like, wow, like my mind right now is like, well, because Thank you.
You're welcome, and I'm glad you mentioned one thing, and that was the wise guy and with the door and the one that without the
Oh,
door.
it was so funny.
Yeah.
I was like
Oh, funny.
rolling on the ground laughing, like I'd
Yeah.
never seen it. And I would not have seen it if it wasn't for my.
Your friend
He's
said.
kind of weird.
Yeah.
I call him a nerd because he is, but he's like, yeah.
So this is the important point, the necessity for many people of a teacher. That you do need, we need each other to help us to
We're all
do these.
mirrors
We
to each
can't,
other.
yeah, but some are clearer mirrors than others.
Of course.
And so we need to find the people who will help us get our door.
Trust.
Yeah, because, and that's the whole point of the wisdom dialogue. That's a long tradition in human history, millennium,
Mhm.
of wise teachers and novices
Mhm.
sharing wisdom down the ages. And it's something that, you have to be very careful about a teacher. You have to use clear judgment. Is this person really taking me where I need to go? But, and not everybody is a guru person. I'm not an attached person to a guru, but some people, that's what they need, and it's extremely helpful. But I do recognize, I don't know who you follow, but Goldstein for me is sort of my wisdom figure, I guess you could say. I don't idealize him, but he is a point of reference for me in helping.
Yeah.
So it is important not to try this alone,
Mhm.
but with the guidance of somebody to support you.
And I love that you love Joseph because so typically there was like a lot of the fundamentals of Vipassana, like insight meditation was Joseph Goldstein,
Yeah.
Jack Kornfield, and Sharon
Sharon's also.
Salzberg. And so Jack is actually a big storyteller.
He is,
You
yeah,
know,
and he
and-
tells good ones.
Yes, and
Yeah.
it's so fascinating to me that that wasn't actually your teacher.
Oh, yeah,
You
no,
know,
that's
in a
right,
way-
yeah.
In a way
yeah.
that, because Jack, I don't know if you listened to any of his teachings, like on YouTube or anything, but if you ever have a chance to explore his teachings, he really is a storyteller. Like
Mhm.
all of his Dharma teachings will be fundamentally, and that's my
Yeah,
certified.
yeah.
But I would say at least a half of his teaching will be in story.
So
To help you take the concept and relate it, like you said, through the power of story. And Ram Dass at one point had said to him something to the effect of, Jack, he's just told us story. And he's like, that's never gonna happen.
Jack Cornfield
Yeah.
with a K.
Cornfield with a K.
Yeah. Google him.
Yeah.
He's really, how old is he now, Christina?
Oh,
He's
he's
in his, well, in
30.
his 70s.
Yeah, I was
anyway.
gonna say close to
Yeah,
80.
yeah, like Joseph, they were all in the band together.
Mhm.
But yeah, his talks are very accessible. You can trust him, don't you feel? You
Oh,
must,
absolutely.
yeah. He's not a flake or a whack job. He's the real deal. He's somebody that you can rely on to be.
that's like your next speaker. She's
Yeah,
the deal,
yeah,
like,
and that's that's why I say it's so important. Yeah, and you need to know that because it is important to connect with people that you really feel deeply that I can trust. Because there's lots of people out there that are not going to take you far enough or
Right.
in the right direction.
The beauty about Katie is that she is a very knowledgeable, wise, like professional, but she's also very in tune with her intuition side. So she's so,
Yeah.
so lovely.
So come back every week.
Yeah.
Next
Yeah.
week's everybody.
Back next week, then you just know.
Yeah.
Does anyone else have any? Yes. Thank you.
I'm curious about when you said, I'm not sure quite what your words to use, so. What I would call the tension between the unstory itself and replacing stories.
Oh,
And
yeah.
and it's funny because when you finished the thought, you asked a question, I had a question. And then you said something right there, reading the last few bits. That I was really interested. So which I will choose a specific question. You said that and getting into the unstoried self for meditation, then you get rid of one story and the new one's not come up. Which all good. So my questions, I think, are to how do you have any thoughts around meditation getting to the unstoried self? How long that unstoried self we can hold
Oh,
beyond
yeah.
meditation?
mhm.
And my second question is, whether through meditation or outside of meditation, when we become aware of our stories, but we find ourselves, if not replacing them, updating. All of a sudden we see the world slightly different. Oh, wait a minute, oh, I perceive this.
Yeah,
I can perceive it differently.
yeah.
That's the stuff. Recently, where I've shifted my narrative.
Mhm.
And I'm wondering to what, so my question there is, do you see replacing updated stories at all as contributing towards an unstoried self by way of a more, don't believe everything your mind tells you, but I'm getting a less punished.
Yeah.
A
Yeah.
more informed story.
Mhm. There you go. A more informed story. Your first question, both aspects of what you asked are brilliant questions. And the first one, how long do you stay in that state of the unstoried self? One can't live a normal life in a state of complete unstoriedness. You just can't. That's not possible. But that is, if you can maintain some semblance of unstoriedness for the length of your meditation practice, 40 minutes, half an hour, 5 minutes, of whatever it is, just that practice of taking the mind out of the story is the helpful part. How long you stay there, I mean, adepts and mystics will stay for a very long time, but at the end of the day, most mystics have to eat and they have to function in the world, and they have to be subject to stories. So you have to release yourself from the complete unstoriedness.
And is it fair, sorry,
Yes, please.
Is it fair to say that you would agree that when I go home later, if I can remember for a moment I wasn't in the story stuff,
Yeah,
the awareness of it,
Yeah.
I think that
yes, it is. And I think the point is the facility of the mind to move in and out of the story. It's not how long do I stay there once I'm out. You stay there as long as you must. You do what is necessary, as some monks would say. One does what is necessary. And it can be a very restful state as well. So the mind appreciates just not being offline for a little while, but still very connected with the point of meditation, which is frequently the breath for many people. So it's not that you're in a complete blank, that there's nothing going on. It's that you're single focused and you can move the mind out of the story, and you have that focus to keep you away from the story for a while. But the example that comes to mind for the rest of your question is another comment that Larry Rosenberg made about standing in line at the store, and the lady in front of you has decided to use all her coupons, and they're all a mess, and she's dropped some on the floor, and you've got 2 items and would like to get out of the store. And so you begin to create a story about this, and you get angry, and the story supports the anger, and the anger builds into the story. And it's at that kind of a juncture where you have a choice to, what he says, to drop into the breath. He doesn't even say go to unstoriedness. He just says drop into the breath and just release the story, and it's not so much the releasing, it's moving into the breath. And that takes you out of that knot of suffering, which you are in the store, in the lineup. And it short circuits the story that you're going to elaborate on as you leave this and tell all your friends about what a terrible time you had in the lineup, and it just escalates and it becomes junk stories after a while. So it's cultivating the facility with which you can move out of that state of storyness into the breath. And once you can do that, you're released of the story. So no one's asking you to jump off the cliff and be in oblivion and nothing's going on. Can you move away, just step aside from the story? Does that help? I don't know if that's,
And I just want to say, just a comment now.
yeah,
It seems to me the meditation, focus on humility those thoughts.
mhm, mhm,
And I find it interesting that you are talking about thoughts, with talking about stories, which I'm totally agree. And I think that, find that interesting and
yeah,
helpful thought.
yeah,
Because I think that the story, blends, the emotional need to create order out of the more factualness. of
yeah,
thoughts,
yeah.
relatively speaking. So, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. It's a very interesting dynamic, and there's many ways of looking at it. Sometimes the agitated self or the disturbed mind finds comfort in thought. Yeah, so you start thinking about something, and when you note that, oh, thought is happening, and I'm starting to build a story, and you just put the brakes on that and ask yourself, what's the emotion that's driving this? And if you can just go back to that sensation on the pulse, as it were, not in the thoughts, but in the pulse, what started the story in the first place, and be kind to that, and just hold that. Frequently, it settles on its own. But if you get caught in the story, why it's a free for all. You'll just keep building on it, and so the noting is crucially important. But you can note stories at any point. You can be. I'm sure those of you who meditate, you've had 10 minutes of storyline while you're sitting meditating, right? And you're just off. You've solved every problem, and then you emerge thinking, oh yeah. So that moment of emerging out of the storyline is the crucial one. Oh yeah, there's my mind. It became aware of itself.
I think one thing that I've grown in my practice is also becoming more aware of the repetitive nature of our stories.
Oh yeah.
That like, if you really pay attention in the morning from when you wake to saving lunch, chances are a good portion of those stories in the morning are the same.
The
Like a
same.
record of.
Yeah, I know.
It's group that, like, record.
It is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so there's this opportunity for interruption
Yeah.
and maybe some laughter, and it's like, oh, there's my story again. And to actually find within us a new narrative.
Yeah.
Because one of my deep run narratives is there's not enough time. Like I gotta get our story.
Yeah,
And
you went
so-
through those preparations pretty fast tonight. You were really on it.
It's true. And so it's this feeling of lately I've been upending that to say, instead of it's 6:01, I need to be meeting Mary at 6:20, and my daughter is talking to me, and then I'm like, okay, I do have enough time.
Yeah,
And I'll just upend it in its entirety, and I can feel my body relax.
yeah,
And the emotional response that would normally have been causing me this tension and this suffering and this mental angst is diffused.
Right.
And even for the briefest of moment, I gave myself permission and space to say, oh, I do have time.
Yeah.
There is time.
Yeah.
And I'm doing that much more regularly when I feel myself rubbing into those chronic stories that I have for myself. So I just share that as an invite in our day-to-day mindfulness of how do we cultivate space for ourselves?
Yeah,
From those stories that we continually tell, when we become aware. First is awareness, and then actually, is this a limiting belief that really isn't true?
but it is a kind of a replacement story. Because she didn't step out of stories altogether. There's a new story. There is time. And
Yeah.
that opens up a whole new narrative right there, doesn't it, Christine? So there's your, yeah, the replacement stories should always be leading you to more peacefulness in yourself and more
Exactly.
compassion for other people, and that's
Yes.
that's the measure that you use. It's not whether the story is true or not. I live by lots of things that aren't true, but they take me good places. So.
Don't go.
It also makes me think about like getting out of victimhood. We
Oh,
get stuck in victimhood and
Yeah.
this person did this to me and this
Oh, yeah.
person did that to me, but you know what? So what?
is that a junk story? Yeah, it's a junk
It
story.
doesn't matter.
It
At
doesn't,
the end of the day.
yeah, and it's
I can
exhausting.
find humor and what they did, and maybe they did it to me because
Yeah,
they were in a good state of mind.
it wasn't you.
Yeah.
It's exhausting when you find yourself
It is.
becoming exhausted by your thought patterns. And victimhood is a good one. That's a very tiring way to live.
Yeah.
That your fatigue is a signal.
Absolutely.
So Mary, we're about to come to the end. It's 8:26. Perhaps you can give us your top 3 takeaways from tonight.
Oh, I forgot about this. Okay, well, I have to go back to my,
It can even just be what's here now, because then we had such
Yeah, what's here now?
lovely evolution discussion.
the top 3 are in no particular order. There's nothing, stories are the heart of who we are. Stories have an ethical valence to them. They can make you happy, or they can make you sad. They can make other people happy, or they can make them sad. And the mind is more powerful than you think to step away from the tensions that stories often present us with and look at the larger picture and make decisions from a new perspective. So that was 3.
And I'm sure we'll have our own 3 as well, so thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you for your comments and
Thank you.
attention.
Definitely.
Thank you. I hope it ends your day on a better note than it started.